Oh, hi, Bobby here. I want to talk today about what I think is the real reason why so many professional guitarists use amp modelers. But before we get into that, in a previous video I said that I wasn't a YouTuber, and I think someone who is very much a YouTuber took offense to that and thought that I was maybe considering myself better than people who make YouTube videos for a living. I make YouTube content. Obviously that much is clear. What I meant by that is that I don't produce content regularly enough to consider myself a YouTuber. I'd love to have the time to invest in, you know, kind of doing this a bit more frequently, but I've been very, very busy lately with various stuff. I'm not going to bore. Oh, I will bore you with it. No, I won't bore you with it. Just various things going on. Also, you know, these videos do take quite a long time. This one probably won't, because I'm going to do as little editing as possible. But I found myself kind of sitting there for hours, kind of editing and finessing videos. Believe it or not, because I know they don't look particularly polished, and they can be quite time consuming. But anyway, that's besides the point. We're going to talk about amp modelers. Before we do that, just another little aside. Don't forget you can pick up my free blues rock phrasing course. I'll put a link to that in the description below, completely free. And if you do like this content, I know everyone on YouTube says this, please consider hitting like and subscribe, because it will really help to grow the channel, as they say. But yeah, let's talk about amp modelers. And this is what I consider to be the bottom line. I don't want to, it's going to sound arrogant if I say the last word on why I think so many people use amp modelers. But, you know, this whole kind of modelers versus real valve amps debate has raged on since the days of the Line 6 pod. And, you know, there are purists sitting very firmly in the, you know, I'm not going to stray from my valve amp camp. You know, there's a lot of kind of gatekeeping when it comes to this sort of territory, and that's fine, but it's kind of beside the point. If you are someone who, whenever you see somebody using a modeler, or whenever you hear of somebody using a modeler, will jump straight to, you should use a real valve amp, then you're not really part of the conversation. And what I mean by that is there are a number of reasons why a lot of pro touring musicians and gigging musicians, you know, whether it's functions or big tours, big arena tours, or studio work, there's a reason why so many people are opting for modelers over valve amps. And I think it mostly boils down to, or largely boils down to, should I say, whether you are the artist or whether you are supporting the artist. Now, if you're somebody like Joe Bonamassa or John Mayer or Slash or David Gilmour or Mark Tremonti, you know, I can name many, many guitarists where it's your name on the ticket. You know, you are the artist. You are the person who people are paying money to see. Now, you're going to have a crew, you know, a guitar tech. You're gonna have the budget, or at least the amp collection, to have a backup for everything. You know, every kind of a backup pedal board, a backup amp. If something kind of goes down, you're gonna have a lot of support from, you know, an amp manufacturer who will be there on hand if you know, if your gear breaks down, even if your backup amp breaks down, you're gonna have a lot of kind of support. And there's a certain aesthetic when it comes to seeing that original artist on stage using a real amp. Of course there is, and of course, as working musicians, love to have that luxury of kind of turning up to the gig with, you know, like a couple of half stacks and a whole van full of gear, and have it all kind of set up for us. That would be brilliant, wouldn't it, in an ideal world? And that, up until kind of maybe 20 years ago, or maybe even sort of 10 years ago, when amp modeling became so good, that was our only option, you know. I'll come back to that in a bit, because I've played more gigs with real valve amps. You know, if people, for all the people out there telling me, you should use a real amp, I still do, and I've played more gigs with valve amps, having started gigging in 1989, played more gigs with valve amps than I have with modelers. And if you only play gigs where you need access to, say, 3 sounds, you know, a clean sound, a crunch sound, and a lead sound, and you're happy to kind of lug around a 2x12 or a 4x12, you know, and a pedal board, then obviously it's a no-brainer that you should use a valve amp. I still do. I play with a blues artist, an amazing harmonica player and singer called Will Wild, and I use real amps for that gig. I have used modelers on a blues gig. I know the kind of blues community is there's a lot of kind of gatekeeping and a lot of purists in that world, and you know, there is a certain stigma to using modelers. I've had to do it, especially with gigs abroad, where you know you don't know what the back line is gonna be when you get there. You could be plugging into a potato, you know, so it's better to have, or it's good to have kind of the sounds that you like at your disposal if you can kind of stomach the stigma of using a modeler. And I've managed to pull the wool over people's ears using modelers. You know, people have complimented me on my amp when I've been using a modeler, because people do listen with their eyes a lot of the time, and we'll get into that in a minute in a bit more depth. But picture the scene. If you land a gig doing a modern tour, and on the first day you turn up with, I don't know, say 3 amps and 3 cabs, and you say, right, I'm going to go wet, dry, wet, I'm going to crank this up here. You know, the MD will probably say, no, you're going to go M6, M1, M25 and home, mate. You know, a lot of tours these days are silent stages, or at least very, very quiet stages, as a lot of kind of pop artists and kind of heritage artists, if you know, artists that have been around since, you know, maybe the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, as they are kind of getting older, they want to protect their hearing. They don't want, you know, a kind of wall of marshals behind them and a drummer, you know, kind of smacking 7 bells out of the kit. Normally drummers are behind screens now. I play with some bands where, I play with one band in particular where nothing is mic'd. All you hear from the stage, you know, if the PA suddenly shut down, all you would hear would be the horns and the drums, and maybe a little bit of vocals. You know, I'm using the modeler. The bass player is going direct to front of house. The keyboard player is obviously going, you know, kind of DI'd. That's the way a lot of tours are run these days. You know, conversely with the blues band, everyone's amplified. You know, the keyboard player is using a real Leslie cabinet, and it sounds great. It sounds great. It feels great on stage. There is that kind of, I know there's that kind of, you know, pushing air, kind of trouser flappage thing that you can only get when you're standing in front of an amp, and it feels great. It feels great when you're on stage. It feels great to know, it feels very, very organic to know that you are creating that air. You know, it's all kind of being done with valves. It's a wonderful feeling. I saw Greg Koch recently, and he was playing it was plugged into I think it was an Imperial Royalist combo, and I was right near the front of the stage, and it felt great. You could feel the amp, you know, and you could feel that he was feeling the amp and responding in real time to the amp. But, and it's been said before, that is not the signal chain, that is not the sound that you hear at the vast majority of gigs where you're a few rows back and you're getting everything through front of house. That's not the sound you hear on recorded music. You don't hear, unless you're experiencing it firsthand, you don't hear the sound of an amp in a room. You hear a speaker cab that's been mic'd and has been put through a desk or into a console, and then through speakers, and that is what modelers are capturing extremely accurately these days. And I know there are some people who say, but I can tell the difference. You can't. I can, my ears are special. They're not, mate. They are. I've got special ears. They're so much specialer than everyone else's ears. Those people are listening with their eyes. If they know that there's a modeler being used on stage, they will use their prejudices to determine whether or not they think that's a good sound. And I know there are exceptions. I know there are bad modelers, or there are bad you can get a bad sound out of a modeler, but you can get a bad sound out of an amp, and you can get a bad sound out of a microphone and a bad front of house engineer that can make your amp sound like a packet of crisps. There is such a thing as kind of option paralysis when it comes to getting a modeler and cycling through all of the available amp models and all of the iterations of various cabs and various mics. You know, I've done it with the neural stuff. I did it with Fractal kind of back in the day. And I've heard people make what could and should be a kind of organic guitar sound extremely processed and extremely kind of hi-fi, and end up sounding like a kind of early version of a modeler, like a kind of, you know, Line 6 pod. If you go back to the original pod, which I still have somewhere, not within eyeshot unfortunately, but I mean, they sound great for the time, but it doesn't sound like a real valve amp, you know. And I think a lot of people's kind of prejudices were set back then, over 20 years ago. You know, it's not as good as the real thing, so therefore you know, valves are best. And this is coming from, I am a person who's a real big fan of valve amps. I'm looking at a bunch of valve amps over there. Where do purists draw the line? Are there reverb purists who will say, I don't use digital reverb, I instead, you know, grab all of my equipment and I go and set it up in an empty hall, and if that's not reverb enough, then I'll set up in a nearby cathedral because I you know, it's got to be real. The JC120 isn't a valve amp. Does that mean it's not a real amp? I mean, a more kind of modern take on that would be the Fender kind of Tone Master range, you know. Some people might consider them not to be real amps because they're digital and they don't contain valves, but, you know, by definition, they are amplifying the sound. The clue is in the name. Although it did occur to me recently that there is a whole generation of guitarists who maybe will never plug into a valve amp, a real valve amp, or maybe they'll never plug into like a real tube screamer. You know, they'll see green screamer or some sort of variation on, you know, green OD or whatever on their kind of modeler of choice, and they'll know what it looks like, but they won't actually use the real kind of tactile thing. And that's not necessarily, that's technology moving on as far as I'm concerned. And when I say generation, when it comes to instruments, I don't mean age, I don't mean a particular age, I don't mean kind of Gen Z people or whatever. I mean people who started playing at a certain time. You know, you could be 5 years old, you could be 95 years old. You are in that generation of people kind of just getting into the instrument. And there's never been a better time. There's never been a better time to be a guitarist when we've got so much, going slightly off topic now, but when we've got so much stuff at our disposal, we've got so many ways of learning, we've got access to a lot more guitarists than we used to have, you know, directly or indirectly. Lessons, you know, we can learn from our favorite guitarists, whether that's via YouTube, whether it's via, you know, an online course. This isn't a plug for my courses, but, you know, people produce online courses that you couldn't have dreamed of back in the day. In my day, it was going to kind of Rose Morris and spending 30 quid on a Hot Licks or REH video, getting it home, and, you know, the guy's just kind of showing off for an hour. Unless it's Arlen Roth's Chicago Blues Guitar, which is really, really good. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my story and why I got into modelling. Why I got into amp modelling and kind of started using that for touring. Now this goes back to sort of maybe 2006-ish. I started working on initially depping on We Will Rock You, which is the Queen musical at the Dominion Theatre in the West End. And in that show, we used Brian May's original Vox AC30s that were in an ISO box, and they were cranked up full. And we drove everything from the volume knob. We used a treble booster, and it sounded and felt amazing. I then went on to do the show in Austria and Switzerland, and we were still on AC30s then, but we were using the slightly more modern ones, which weren't as good. They didn't quite have that kind of warmth that Brian May's amps, you know, had in London. Around that time, there was just the kind of Line 6 stuff, so we didn't kind of switch to modelers. We used real organic amps. Around sort of 2008, I joined initially as a dep, and initially just for kind of US shows. I joined the Australian Pink Floyd show, and I was using my Cornford MK50 Mark II, which is a brilliant amp. I know that's not what Gilmour used, but I didn't have the budget to go out and buy, you know, 2 high watts and loads of Pete Cornish stuff and, you know, kind of replicate everything. I had my Cornford amp, which was my amp. I had a Marshall JCM 2000 as a backup. I'm chuckling just because it's not really a kind of Floydy amp. It was more of a kind of rock metal amp. Sounded great for that sort of stuff. But I used that for a few years, and then that version of the Australian Pink Floyd show became Brit Floyd, which then toured America, and I was a member of that band kind of permanently for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. Hey you. Sorry, I get PTSD thinking about it, but I did that for a while, and there was one gig, and I think it was this isn't kind of venue name dropping when it comes to venues, but this was at Red Rocks, I think, in Colorado, which is a big 10,000 capacity outdoor amphitheater, amazing gig where the view from the stage and the view of the stage are equally spectacular. If you're looking at the stage, you can see downtown Denver, you can see the lights. If you're looking from the stage, there's this, it's just amazing. If you check out, I think U2 did a famous, not you and your mate, or you, but U2, the band, you know, Bono and that guy, you know, the band U2. They did a live video in the 80s from Red Rocks. You might have seen footage of that. Incubus did one as well. You check it out, you know, check it out on YouTube. You're on YouTube right now. Don't check it out now. Watch my video to the end and then check it out. But amazing venue. And just before going on, my cornfoot went down and I had to use my Marshall. A valve blew in my cornfoot, should I say. And it wasn't the first time. Valves do, you know, they blow. That's one of the perils of valve amps. And I had to, my tech set up my Marshall, and it sounded like I plugged into a packet of Walker's Crisps or Lay's chips if you're in the US. It was really crackly, really horrible. Nothing against Marshall, but it wasn't it wasn't set up right. I didn't have time to get a good sound out of it. Now, kind of fast forward to like maybe sort of 2012, and I got a Fractal Audio Axe FX 2. This was before like the 2 Turbo or whatever, and it was great. It was a real game changer, you know, from playing the sort of show where you have to recreate sounds accurately from multiple eras, you know, such as Pink Floyd's music, you know, playing songs going back to kind of Piper at the Gates of Dawn, you know, Atom Heart Mother, right through to, you know, the Division Bell. So that's a huge, you know, we're talking about decades of kind of sound. We could do it a lot more accurately, and it was absolutely fantastic. And that thing is really, really good, the Axe FX 2. I used that for years, and I used it with the Classic Rock Show, which I then played with. However, people had their prejudices then. There was a guy who used to follow the band around very closely, and he said to me after one gig, I can't remember whether it was with Brit Floyd or a Classic Rock Show, but he said,
"Were you using your Axe FX tonight?"
And I said, yeah. And he said,
"I thought so. It sounded thin."
He didn't have a MacBook with him, but, you know, I'm just in that character. In fact, that character is actually based on the guy, I think. Now, he had already listened with his eyes, found out that, or maybe kind of Googled this Axe FX thing, gone onto some forum, someone had decided it sounds thin. Someone had written that, and then that becomes gospel, you know the way the internet works. Someone has an opinion, and that opinion gets kind of bandied around, and people kind of latch onto it. But I don't need to explain the internet to you, that sort of thing. So, but what he didn't know was that I'd used it on the previous tour. And apparently my amp sounded great then. I mean, the other kind of downside to using valve amps when I was with like a Floyd tribute band was whenever a new song got added to the set that involved or that needed a new effect, say like a fuzz or something, I had to go out and buy that pedal, you know, between 100 and 300 quid, and, you know, somehow kind of work that into my rig just for that one song, or just for that one moment in that one song, you know. And going back to kind of using the Axe FX, it was a lot easier to kind of just program that in. And I then kind of carried on with the Fractal stuff after I left that band. I joined Cliff Richard's band straight away, so that's 9 years ago, 2015. I did the first tour with Axe FX. It sounded great, and then we did some kind of almost sort of fly dates, not sort of throw and go fly dates, you know, where you just sort of, well, you can't, where you stick a kind of pedal board in a suitcase and then rent an amp at the other end. These were, a certain amount of backline was being shipped to, I think, Norway or Denmark, maybe, including my rack that had my Axe FX 2 in it. This was before the days of the AX8, or that may have existed, but I couldn't afford one. I just had this one Axe FX, and the whole rack unit went on a plane, and I was so worried that it might not make it to the other side. You know, it was kind of slightly, it was protected, but it was in like a gator thing. And I kind of thought, well, this isn't as portable as I would like. And around about that time, the Kemper, more kind of touring musicians, we were using Kempers. And the beauty of the Kemper has almost become like, I know I've said some disparaging things recently about Kemper as a company, if you see my kind of Kemper Tantrum video. But, you know, the Kemper kind of toaster was a lot of backline companies were using those as their kind of modeler of choice. It became the industry standard, and the whole kind of one of the kind of USPs was that you could use a USB, and you could just take that little USB stick and you have all your sounds on it. Rent a Kemper at the other end, whack it in, bish bash bosh, Bob's your uncle. You've got the whole set there when it works. But I got the Kemper because you could fit that. You could fit the power head and the remote and a volume pedal into a Pelican 1610 case, and the whole thing weighed less than 23 kilos, which was the kind of baggage allowance on most commercial flights. So it was like the kind of touring rig of choice before the kind of Kemper stage and the Kemper player and all that. So that became the kind of go-to. Around about that time, so I got a Kemper. I sold my Fractal gear because I couldn't afford to buy another Axe FX 2, and by that time I think the Axe FX 2 Turbo or 3 was coming out. As a company, for a long time they did upgrade their models very, very frequently, and it was very frustrating when you dropped a load of money on the floor. You dropped a load of money on a unit and it's kind of superseded months later. But they're ambitious. So I started using Kempers for a few years, and I had 2 Kemper toasters. Went with that for a while, and I bought the Kemper Stage, which I think is an altogether better unit if you're not running a cab on stage. This thing is solid, really, really solid. This has got a little dent in it actually, where I think a slide fell on it, but really kind of stable unit. And I've carried a lot of stuff as spares. I bought this HX Stomp, which I picked up from Jake Wilson. Got this as a spare to keep in my bag. Barely used it, and as a result, it kind of got smashed to bits in my bag. These 2 knobs were sheared off. I think my bag got dropped at some point, and my brother-in-law had to kind of glue them in. It's got some, Line 6 has kind of long had a reputation for being a bit sort of Fisher-Pricey and a little bit kind of prosumer. Not that they don't make great products, but I wouldn't recommend this for any real kind of hardcore kind of touring work, because it's got these plasticky knobs and they're not very stable, shall we say. But great unit, great for the money. Around about the time I was kind of I had a few issues with the Kemper. I had a few issues with the Kemper remote and the toaster talking to one another, and my gear. I've mentioned this in my previous video, but my gear would go down mid gig, and eventually Kemper didn't really follow up on their support. So I started looking at neural DSP, and I got the Quad Cortex, which I've used for the last couple of years, and it's absolutely brilliant. I love it. I know some people have formed an opinion of it. People haven't even plugged into one, but the neural stuff's really good. I mean, the plugins are absolutely brilliant. At the time of writing, there are 4 plugins you can use. I think you can certainly use the Soldano and the Pliny plugin. I have those, and they sound excellent. It's great to be able to kind of take a Soldano with you everywhere you go. And I think at the moment it's the Fortin Nameless Suite and the Gojira. But they are, slowly, gradually, soon, making all their plugins compatible on the Quad Cortex. I've also messed around with this. This is excellent as well. This is a really good kind of, I guess, sort of halfway house between a valve amp and a real amp. This is a Victory jack, but Victory make a range of these V4 amp pedals, and it's got an all-valve power amp, all-valve preamp. And it's got the 2 notes speaker emulation on it. Really, really good. You can use this on top of the speaker, or you can use it on your pedal board. These are great. I have the Sheriff version of this. Speaking of Victory amps, with the gigs I've been playing recently with Will Wild, I've just been using, and this is a real amp, there's nothing digital about this. This is the Victory Sheriff 22, 2-channel kind of plexi lunchbox style head. That's my kind of valve amp of choice at the moment. I just use that through a little 1x12, Victory 1x12, solely because it's portable. It's not in a flight case. I'm getting old, so I don't want to be kind of, I've got a bad back anyway. I don't want to be lugging 412s, even 212s around these days. And as a backup for that, a while ago, about a year ago, I got the Tonex One. just out of curiosity, because they're really affordable. And I hadn't used the old Tonex, the original Tonex, and I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose. This can kind of be any pedal you want. You can make this a tube screamer if you want, you know. I did kind of stick this on my board for a few kind of function gigs, and I wasn't entirely happy with it because I find the software really kind of difficult to use and a bit clunky. So what I initially used this for was, that's a weird pronunciation, used this for, big emphasis on the D. What I originally used this for was to have a clean sound, like a kind of Fender Deluxe reverb or a Fender Super Reverb, as one of the amps, and then switch to kind of a plexi for lead stuff and stick a load of drive pedals in front of it, have it on the end of my board. In reality, when I got it to the gig, my lead sound, or the dirty sound, was way quieter than the clean sound. I didn't have my laptop with me. I tend not to take my laptop to gigs with me to kind of tweak it. So I kind of had to live with it like that for a couple of gigs. It was like a weekend away with a few gigs. There's a lot of back and forth and a lot of kind of faffage involved with using this. At the moment, I use this, I haven't used it at the moment, but I keep this in my bag as a spare to use if this goes down. So if my real valve amp goes down on a gig with, on a blues gig with Will Wild, in theory, I will use this on the end of my board, which just has a tuner and a bunch of drive pedals and boosters and fuzz and stuff on it. And I will take one of these off and plug this in, have this at the end of the signal chain going straight into the PA. And on this, I've stored two versions of the same amp model, a kind of plexi. I think it's a JTM 45. Yeah, it's a JTM 45. A cleaner sound and a dirtier sound, and the pedals will do the rest of the work. And that's really handy, you know, to have a spare rig. David Beebe mentioned this in a recent video about the Nano Cortex. If someone had told you 10, 12 years ago that you'd have this tiny box with access to all of these, you know, amazing sounds, you'd be blown away. But these days, kind of people almost expect it, or they take it for granted. That's the way technology works. But, you know, it's amazing to have a mini pedal that you can just put in your pocket or stick in your bag, and that will act as an adequate backup to my rig. Obviously, I prefer to use the real valve amp on stage because, you know, you're going to have with the blues gigs, we're not using in-ear monitors, so you'd have to deal with this coming through the wedges. That's another really important point, or really valid point, should I say, about modelers and why a lot of pro guitarists use them over valve amps is the sort of pop gigs that a lot of people do, and even, you know, a lot of kind of function gigs now are predominantly to click track. They're predominantly with in-ear monitors. So, you know, even if you were using a real amp that was mic'd, you'd be hearing that in your in-ears. You wouldn't be hearing it in wedges. So, you know, works great in that particular setup. Now, speaking of neural DSP stuff, I recently got hold of a Nano Cortex. Now, this is an excellent product, I think. I know there's been a little bit of criticism because I think people were expecting a mini quad Cortex, you know, in a smaller form factor like the HX Stomp is to the Helix. I don't know what people were expecting. People were saying,
You can't run plugins on it.
I mean, of course you can't. It's not 2035. And people have been arguing back and forth online, you know, saying things like,
It doesn't do modelling.
Your mum doesn't do modelling.
It doesn't have drive.
Your dad doesn't have drive.
It doesn't have a flange slot.
So I can see a lot of use for this. Certainly, you know, I've captured a bunch of pedals on this. Haven't captured any amps as yet. I use it at home as an audio interface. I know I can use any audio interface. I can use my quad Cortex as an audio interface, but, you know, it's great for just sort of, you know, using plugins. I have it set up for practice, for teaching. I can, you know, it's portable enough that I can kind of take this away with me, take it on tour with me, use it as a backup in case my quad Cortex goes down. I currently have 4 sounds stored on this. I've got 2 clean sounds, one with chorus, one without, which is based on, which is a capture of David Beebe's Fender Deluxe reverb that he did recently. So thanks, Beebs, for those. And a couple of kind of lead sounds. One of them is actually David Beebe's hairy brown eye, Friedman capture. So yeah, really, really great product. And of course, you know, you can power it with USB-C as well. So that's a handy little thing to have. So, you know, kind of modelers everywhere. What else have I got? I mean, I was just thinking about all the things I've got that kind of, you know, that are amp modelers. I've sold a few things, obviously, over the years. One thing I do keep in my bag for gigs that I bought during lockdown was the Boss Wazar Air headphones. Initially, it's kind of like a novelty thing. I thought it was like a kind of novelty thing. I don't use the kind of gyroscopic setting, you know, where you can kind of put the amp in a virtual position in the room. I just use them on loud gigs where there's a lot of stuff going on backstage, you know, say at festivals where there's just constant sound all day and you want to do a bit of playing and you want to be able to hear yourself. You can just kind of plug in, play over a backing track and shut yourself off from the world. And I found them to be extremely useful and, you know, a great kind of practice tool on gigs. Really portable. The battery is kind of quite long lasting. You know, it will certainly get you through a weekend of gigs. The bottom line is we really are spoilt for choice these days. You know, there's a reason why people will continue always, I think, to use valve amps, and there's a reason why people will use modelers. And I totally get that there's a stigma, you know, I totally get that some people wouldn't want to use something digital, but you know, where do you kind of draw the line when it comes to kind of advancing technology? Do you not watch EastEnders and instead paint a picture of Ian Beale on your wall and just stare at that for half an hour? Probably be more interesting. But ultimately, the choice isn't down to either or. Both digital and analog can coexist. Valve amp users aren't renouncing their vintage amps in favour of modelers. You can use both. And as I say, you know, it's just choosing the right tool for the job. Oh, that was interesting, wasn't it, Bouncer? Thank you very much for watching. I've been Bobby Harrison, and I hope to be again in the future. Have a very good Christmas, and I'll see you soon.